November 1910. A private railcar leaves a New Jersey train station just after dark. The passengers have been given a single unusual instruction: no last names. Use first names only, or fake ones entirely. Don't acknowledge each other if strangers are present. Don't be seen travelling together. These aren't criminals on the run. They're some of the most powerful men in America. Bankers, senators, and finance ministers who between them controlled an estimated 1/4 of all the wealth on Earth. Their destination, Jekyll Island, Georgia. A private retreat so exclusive that even the staff were replaced for the week with hand-picked personnel who had no idea who they were serving. Their mission: to secretly redesign the American money supply. And the plan they drafted inside that private clubhouse? It became the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The same system that controls every dollar printed, borrowed, and spent in this country today. Most people are taught that central banking was a natural evolution of financial markets, a sensible response to the bank panics of the 1800s, a government institution created to protect the public. But what if that story was written by the very men who needed you to believe it? America before the Fed. To understand what really happened on Jekyll Island, you have to understand what America looked like before it. For most of the 1800s, the United States ran without a central bank. Andrew Jackson destroyed the second bank of the United States in 1836. He called it a monster. He paid off the national debt, ran the country on hard money, and left office with a budget surplus. No central authority. No lender of last resort. No one controlling the money supply from the top down. What followed was something modern economists still struggle to explain. The American economy grew faster than any nation in recorded history. Between 1870 and 1910, the United States went from a recovering post-war country to the largest industrial economy on Earth. Railroads, steel, oil, electricity, all of it built without a central bank managing the process. But it wasn't smooth. There were panics. 1873, 1893, 1907, bank runs, credit crises, businesses collapsing overnight. And each panic was used methodically to build the public case for what was coming. Here is the part the textbooks consistently leave out. Every major financial panic of that era was preceded by deliberate credit contraction. The large banks would tighten lending, call in loans early, and restrict the money supply. Then they would watch as the dominoes fell. Regular people lost their savings, small local banks failed, and the large banks, the ones who had engineered the tightening, moved in and bought up the wreckage at cents on the dollar. This is not speculation. Economists who have gone back through the records from the period have traced the mechanics of each panic and found the same fingerprints every time. The panic of 1907 was the final trigger. J.P. Morgan personally intervened to stop the crisis. He gathered the bankers in his private library, decided which institutions would survive and which would fail, and stabilized the markets with his own credit. And then from the rubble came the argument that America needed a permanent lender of last resort. What they did not say out loud, they intended to be that institution. The Jekyll Island meeting. Jekyll Island sits just off the coast of Georgia. In 1910, it was owned by the Jekyll Island Club, an exclusive retreat for America's wealthiest families. The Vanderbilts, the Morgans, the Rockefellers. If your name wasn't on the list, you didn't get on the boat. In November of that year, Senator Nelson Aldrich sent out quiet invitations framed as a duck hunting trip. Aldrich was the chairman of the National Monetary Commission, a government body created to reform the banking system after the 1907 panic. He was also the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller, Jr. The men he invited were Frank Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank of New York; Henry Davison, senior partner at J.P. Morgan & Company; Arthur Shelton. Aldrich's private secretary, A. Piatt Andrew, the assistant secretary of the United States Treasury; Benjamin Strong, a Morgan banker who would later become the first head of the New York Federal Reserve; and Paul Warburg, a German-born banker who had joined the powerful Kuhn, Loeb banking house and was widely considered the most sophisticated financial mind of his generation. These 7 men represented an estimated 1/4 of the entire world's wealth. They travelled separately. They arrived quietly. And for 9 days they locked themselves inside the private clubhouse on an island chosen specifically because ordinary Americans would never visit it. What came out of those 9 days was a complete blueprint for a central banking system, one specifically designed to be sold to the public as a government institution. It would be called the Federal Reserve. Paul Warburg reportedly said afterward that they spent considerable time selecting the right name. Not a bank, not a corporation, a reserve, government sounding, permanent sounding, safe. The Federal Reserve is a private banking consortium. Its member banks are private corporations. Its internal deliberations are not subject to full congressional oversight. Its books were not independently audited for decades after its founding. Frank Vanderlip confirmed the meeting himself in a 1935 article in the Saturday Evening Post, writing that the participants had been as secretive and furtive as any conspirators, because they understood that if it became known their group had written a banking bill together, that bill would have had no chance of passing Congress. He said that, in print, in 1935. What they were really protecting. Most people who find the Jekyll Island story stop there. 6 rich men wrote a bill in secret. Corrupt, certainly. But history is full of corruption. The question that rarely gets asked is why 1913? Why that specific year? Because 1913 was not just the year the Federal Reserve was created. It was the same year the 16th Amendment was ratified, establishing the federal income tax. The same year the 17th Amendment passed, removing the election of senators from state legislatures and handing it to direct popular vote, which made individual senators far more susceptible to financial pressure and media influence. 3 foundational changes to American power in a single year, all working in the same direction. Now widen the lens further. Why? Something researchers in the alternative history space have been examining for decades. The late 1800s and early 1900s produced extraordinary architecture on a scale that mainstream history has never fully explained. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893 erected hundreds of massive neoclassical structures in under 2 years on muddy swampland. Grand Union stations, federal courthouses, state capitals that still stand today with acoustic engineering and internal systems that modern architects study quietly and carefully. Where did the knowledge come from? How does a country emerging from a devastating civil war suddenly produce infrastructure rivaling ancient Rome in a single generation using technologies that were supposedly brand new? Researchers in the Tartarian and mudflood communities argue that what we call the Industrial Revolution was actually a recovery period, that the world inherited in the 1800s was not a world being newly constructed, but a world being reclaimed and absorbed, that the grand classical structures of that era were remnants of something older, something the official record attributed to the wrong century. The grand exhibitions, the world's fairs, the sudden appearance of fully functioning infrastructure in cities that had supposedly been wilderness a decade earlier. The presence of hydraulic systems and electrical networks in buildings dated before those technologies were supposedly invented. If any part of that framework holds, then the Federal Reserve becomes something more than a financial scandal. A civilization in recovery from a reset would need resource allocation on a massive scale. That allocation requires financial control. Not influence over individual banks, but control of the mechanism that creates money itself. The Federal Reserve handed that mechanism to a private consortium and dressed it in the language of public service. The passage of the Act. The bill that came out of Jekyll Island had to be publicly repackaged before it could be introduced to Congress. If the names behind it were known, the legislation would have died in committee. Woodrow Wilson was elected president in 1912. He ran as a progressive reformer, a challenger to the concentrated financial power of the Gilded Age. What most voters did not know was that his campaign had been substantially funded by the same banking interests behind the Jekyll Island plan. He was a managed candidate, credible enough to reassure the public, useful enough to sign what was already written. The Federal Reserve Act passed on December 23, 1913. Most congressmen had left for Christmas recess. The vote was brought to the floor with thin attendance and signed into law the same day. Wilson said publicly that the Federal Reserve would end the era of concentrated banking power in America. In private correspondence published later, he wrote something different, that he was a most unhappy man, that he had unwittingly ruined his country, that a great industrial nation is controlled by its credit, and that their system of credit had been concentrated in the hands of a few men at the top. What is not disputed is what came next. The Federal Reserve's first decades were defined by exactly the instability it was supposedly created to prevent. The credit expansion of the 1920s, the bubble, and then 1929, when the money supply was deliberately contracted in a way that the Federal Reserve's own later internal records acknowledged as a primary factor in transforming a recession into the Great Depression. Engineered expansion, engineered contraction, wealth transferred upward during the collapse, power consolidated at the top. The same playbook as the panics of the previous century, now running through a permanent institution with a government seal. The architecture of invisible control. Here is what the Federal Reserve story ultimately reveals about how entrenched power operates. It does not announce itself. It does not run for office or declare intentions. It builds structures, quiet, durable, normalized structures that operate in the background, while elected officials and headlines give the public something else to focus on. The men on Jekyll Island understood something most people never learn. Whoever controls the unit of exchange controls everything that can be exchanged. Control the money supply, and the politicians come to you. You do not need to control them. You fund them, and they arrive. The Federal Reserve was established as a private consortium wrapped in public language, a government name, a government seal. Congressional testimony designed to create the appearance of oversight without the substance of it. A system embedded so thoroughly in daily economic life that questioning it sounds to most people like paranoia. Even though the men who built it described exactly what they were doing in their own memoirs and magazine articles. Even though Frank Vanderlip wrote it down in 1935, and the story was absorbed by history without consequence. The structure does not require secrecy to persist. It only requires normalization. And normalization is achieved by making the system invisible, by embedding it so deeply into the mechanics of everyday life, paying rent, taking a loan, earning a paycheck, that the idea of questioning it feels as strange as questioning gravity. Most people never think about where money comes from. They think about how to get more of it, and that distinction is precisely what the architects of Jekyll Island were counting on. Where things stand. The Federal Reserve has never been fully and independently audited. A partial audit conducted in 2011 after years of congressional pressure revealed that between 2007 and 2010, the Fed had issued more than $16 trillion in emergency loans to private banks, including foreign banks, without congressional authorization or public disclosure. $16 trillion, moved without a vote, without public announcement, without full accountability. If any private company had done the same, it would be called embezzlement. Because it was a central bank, it was called monetary policy. The architects of Jekyll Island are long gone. But the institution they designed in November of 1910, in a private clubhouse chosen specifically because ordinary Americans would never see it, is still running, still setting interest rates, still expanding and contracting the money supply, still determining in moments of crisis which institutions survive and which are allowed to fail. The next time you hear that the Federal Reserve is raising rates, or that inflation is temporary, or that a correction is necessary and manageable, remember what Frank Vanderlip actually wrote in the Saturday Evening Post in 1935. They were always very careful about the name. America ran without a central bank for most of its history. During that time, it became the most productive economy the world had ever seen. Then 7 men took a private train to a private island, wrote a financial bill in secret over 9 days, handed it to a managed political candidate, and pushed it through Congress 4 days before Christmas when most members had already gone home. The system they built has controlled the American money supply ever since. Whether that was a straightforward act of financial consolidation, the final control mechanism in a longer recovery process that official history doesn't acknowledge, or something else entirely, the record exists for anyone willing to look at it directly. The question was never whether it happened. The question is what it means that most people still don't know, and why, over a century later, those men who openly admitted it are still entirely absent from most curricula. If this kind of hidden history is what you came for, the next video is on screen now.